In the fall of 1798, 17 travelers vanished without a trace along a rugged 20-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky, leaving behind only abandoned horses and scattered possessions that offered no explanation for their fate. What makes these disappearances even more haunting is not just the number of lives lost, but the chilling fact that local officials deliberately concealed every record of the investigation. For over 200 years, the horrifying truth about the Hardin family farm remained locked away until a county clerk's discovery in 1987 exposed one of the most calculated killing operations in the history of the American frontier. These long-buried documents reveal a murderous enterprise so disciplined and so cleverly masked as acts of Christian generosity that it thrived undetected for 8 years. Before we dive into the story of the farm that became Kentucky's first house of horrors, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because we're about to unravel secrets that powerful families fought to keep hidden forever. And don't forget to tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. We love hearing from fellow mystery seekers. The revelation that exposed the Hardins' crimes began not with a scream in the night, but with a simple act of tidying up old records in a dusty courthouse basement. In 1798, southeastern Kentucky stood on the knife edge between wilderness and settlement, a land that lured thousands of dreamers westward along perilous mountain trails. The Wilderness Road, carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone, 20 years earlier had become the main artery for settlers heading west from Virginia and the Carolinas. Narrow and twisting, it ran for over 200 miles through unforgiving terrain where a single mistake could mean death from exposure wild beasts or the ever-present human predators lurking in the shadows. Along this dangerous route, tiny communities sprang up like wildflowers after rain, each one a fragile promise of safety and hope for weary families. These outposts served as havens where travelers could rest, resupply, and share warnings about the trials that lay ahead. The survival of these settlements often depended on how well they could protect and support the endless stream of migrants passing through. One such place was Millfield, a modest township perched on a crucial bend in the road where the trail dipped from rocky ridges into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. Home to barely 300 people, it was a town where everyone believed they knew everyone else's secrets. Founded in 1794 by Virginia Baptists in search of religious freedom, their influence permeated every part of life. Sunday worship was mandatory, and strict moral codes dictated behavior in everything from drinking to dancing. At the heart of town stood Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log building that served as trading post and informal courthouse run by the gruff ex-militiaman Jeremiah Hendricks, who had fought alongside Boone himself. His shelves held everything a traveler could need: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and precious news from beyond the mountains. Nearby stood the Cumberland Inn, the frontier's finest lodging, owned by Martha Crane, a widowed Philadelphian, who had built it 5 years earlier. For 2 bits a night, guests found a hot meal, a clean bed, and conversation that reminded them of the gentler world they had left behind. The town's spiritual heart was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a simple log building large enough to hold the entire population. There, Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-educated minister who had abandoned Boston for the wild frontier, gave sermons that blended theology with practical survival wisdom, lending the community an air of dignity that drew in weary settlers. Among Millfield's most respected families were the Hardins, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, their sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. They had arrived in 1791, claiming to have fled brutal Indian raids in Virginia. In just a few years, they became pillars of the town, with Ezekiel preaching alongside Reverend Cole and Temperance organizing charity for newcomers. Ezekiel was an imposing man, over 6 feet tall, with a voice that could shake the rafters of the church. while Temperance, a small woman with gray-streaked hair, was famed for her skill with medicinal herbs and her tireless care of the sick. Caleb, 26, shared his father's size and his mother's gentleness. Josiah, 24, was scholarly and acted as the town's teacher in winter. And 22-year-old Mercy was widely admired for her beauty and kindness. Their 400-acre farm 3 miles south of town was one of the most prosperous in the valley, its rich soil producing crops of corn and tobacco, and its creek powering a grist mill. The house itself was shockingly grand for the frontier, with glass windows, fine furniture, and books that hinted at refinement. They had a vast barn, multiple outbuildings, and a reputation for extraordinary generosity, never hesitating to rescue stranded travelers, tend to the sick, or offer shelter. Over time, their farm became a trusted stop on the Wilderness Road, its guest book filled with the names of hundreds who found safety there. But in the harsh world of the frontier where danger lay behind every tree, such trust could prove fatal. The first hint that something sinister was at work came on October 13th, 1798, when Samuel Fletcher, a meticulous merchant renowned for his punctuality, failed to appear in Lexington. For 12 years he had braved the dangerous road between Virginia and Kentucky without ever missing a deadline. When 5 days passed without word, his partner Thomas Greeley knew something had gone terribly wrong. He retraced Fletcher's path, questioning innkeepers and merchants, until he reached Millfield, where the merchant's trail vanished as if swallowed by the earth. On the second day of searching, Greeley found Fletcher's distinctive bay mare grazing calmly near Miller's Creek, still saddled unharmed and curiously well fed. The bridle, however, had been carefully removed and hung from a branch, a quiet and deliberate gesture that suggested a human hand rather than panic. The 43-year-old physician had poured his entire life savings into the wagon. He drove along the Wilderness Road carrying medical instruments, rare books, and carefully chosen supplies worth over $300. That treasure, the product of years of saving and planning, was found scattered beside his overturned wagon near a place locals called Devil's Fork, just 3 miles from the Hardin farm. Nothing appeared to have been stolen except one item, the leather satchel that contained his finest surgical tools. A bone saw, an amputation kit, instruments of such quality that they could not be replaced on the frontier. Authorities claimed Cromwell must have been thrown from his seat and wandered off in confusion before succumbing to the elements. But no wild animal would have carried off a bag of instruments, and no thief would have ignored the coins and trade goods left lying in plain sight. Then came December, when the Henley family vanished during one of the fiercest blizzards in living memory. Jonathan and Elizabeth Henley, traveling with their 2 small children, became trapped when their wagon stuck in a drift only half a mile from the Hardin property. According to Ezekiel Hardin's later statement, they never reached his farm and must have been lost to the storm, their bodies claimed by the frozen wilderness. Yet their remains were never found, and when the snow cleared, the family's wagon was discovered moved from the drift, its snow brushed away, and the interior thoroughly searched. All their clothing and personal belongings had vanished while their tools and food lay untouched. Stranger still were the multiple sets of tracks around the vehicle, proof that more than one person had worked in brutal weather to free the wagon before abandoning it again. January brought an even more shocking case. The disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher whose voice and courage had carried the word of God across the most dangerous parts of Kentucky for 15 years. Cross was feared by outlaws, loved by his congregations, and had survived ambushes, storms, and starvation. Yet one January day, he rode into the woods and never came out. 3 days later, his horse was found calmly grazing with his saddlebag still strapped on, containing nearly $200 in church donations. Robbery could not explain what happened, and local officials were forced to chalk it up to a sudden illness that had struck him down in the wild. Over and over, the pattern repeated itself, abandoned horses grazing in fields or tied to trees. Personal belongings scattered as though dropped in panic, and trails that led closer and closer to the Hardin farm before vanishing entirely. Questioned again and again, the Hardins always had an answer. Yes, they had seen travelers, but only from a distance. Yes, they had offered food and shelter, but most of these people had turned them down, eager to stay on schedule despite storms and warnings of bandits. In every case, their explanation sounded reasonable, and nothing could be proven. Constable Winters, the only man willing to voice his growing suspicions, found himself paralyzed. Ezekiel's charisma and sermons filled churches across the county. Temperance had been a savior during the last fever outbreak. And accusing such a family without undeniable proof would ruin his life. On the frontier, a man's survival depended on alliances, and an unfounded charge against the wrong people meant disgrace, unemployment, or worse. The problem was that these disappearances, though explained away as accidents, were happening too often and always around the same farm, and yet there was never evidence. The Hardins welcomed investigators, allowed their home and barns to be searched, and even joined the hunts for the missing. Their cooperation was so complete, it seemed almost mocking. The first hint that something might finally pierce their mask came from 9-year-old Timothy Voran, who lived with his family 2 miles east of the Hardin farm. Timothy was a curious boy who loved wandering the forests and inventing stories about what he saw. In March of 1799, he went to Constable Winters with a tale that at first sounded like childish fancy. He said that while exploring near Beaver Creek, he had heard terrible screaming coming from the direction of the Hardin property. Not the sounds of an argument or a painful accident, but long, agonizing cries that rose and fell as though someone was suffering beyond endurance. He had heard these sounds at least 5 times. Over the winter, always late at night, always in the darkest hours, and sometimes they were accompanied by strange noises, hammering pulleys creaking, and once voices chanting together in the night. Then the sounds would stop, replaced by an eerie silence. When Winters spoke to Timothy's parents, they admitted they too had heard strange noises, but dismissed them as tricks of wild animals or the groaning of ice in trees. After all, the Hardins were the last people anyone would suspect. But Timothy's story held one detail that Winters could not ignore. When asked for the exact dates of the screaming, he recited them without hesitation. Every one of those nights matched perfectly to the days when travelers had vanished. The timing was too precise, too exact to dismiss as coincidence. Armed with Timothy Vaughan's unsettling testimony, Constable Winters began building a case against the Hardin family with a deliberate patience, born of knowing that any accusation against such respected citizens would demand proof so solid it could not be ignored. He moved quietly at first, interviewing neighbors who lived close enough to hear or see the Hardin farm, choosing his questions carefully so as not to alert the family. Slowly from these conversations, a troubling pattern began to emerge, a tapestry of odd incidents and half-remembered details that people had once dismissed because of the Hardins' reputation, but that when viewed together, made Winters' blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose land bordered the farm on the south, described nights when she saw lanterns swinging in the dark between the buildings long after everyone should have been asleep, along with the sounds of digging and hammering that sometimes lasted until dawn. When she asked Temperance about it at church, she was told they were expanding their root cellar and storage areas and preferred to work at night to save daylight for field work. At the time, the explanation had made sense, but months of night labor without any visible piles of earth now seemed far stranger in hindsight. And Sarah admitted she had often heard muffled voices mingled with the noises, sometimes even faint cries of distress. Old Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant known across the county for his unmatched skill as a tracker and hunter, told Winters of discoveries that chilled him to the core. Along the fence that marked the northern edge of the Hardin property, he had found bone skulls, long bones, shattered fragments, not just from farm animals like horses and cattle, but smaller pieces he could not identify. Many were split open, bearing marks of tools rather than the work of scavengers. Some had been boiled or scorched by heat, their surfaces unnaturally clean. When he questioned Ezekiel about them, he was told wild animals had forced the family to dispose of diseased livestock in the woods, and the rest was the work of scavengers. But Johansen knew the signs. The pattern was too deliberate, the treatment too methodical to be the result of nature. Neighbors also noted how the Hardin family itself seemed to be changing. The once outgoing children were now withdrawn, barely speaking when approached. Caleb and Josiah, previously friendly and helpful, now appeared haunted, distracted, and on edge. Mercy, who had once been the very image of beauty and warmth, looked pale and exhausted, her eyes hollow and her face prematurely lined. She no longer came to dances or community events, and even when she appeared in church, she avoided eye contact, as if afraid of what people might see in her expression. Ezekiel's sermons, too, had grown darker, his voice now filled with fire and visions of judgment, vengeance, and cleansing, a sharp turn from the messages of love and redemption that had once made him beloved. Adding to the suspicion was the discovery that the Hardins' past might not be what they claimed. While they told everyone they had fled Indian raids in eastern Virginia, Winters found no record of such events or any trace of a Hardin family from that area. His letters to Virginia authorities turned up nothing. No records of land births, church memberships, or anything at all. It was as though they had not existed before they appeared in Millfield in 1791, somehow arriving with a wealth of supplies despite their story of losing everything. Then in April of 1799, a new piece of evidence brought Winters closer to certainty. Isaac Brewster, a peddler who traveled across several states and knew every settlement and every rumor, arrived in Millfield with a story he had picked up in eastern Tennessee. A decade earlier, he said at least 15 travelers had disappeared along a stretch of the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. The disappearances had all happened near a prosperous farm owned by a family called Harper. Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 adult children had lived in Tennessee years before, and the more Isaac Brewster described them, the more Constable Winters felt dread close around him. The disappearances in that valley had mirrored exactly what was happening in Kentucky. Travelers passing by the Harper property vanished without a trace, their horses and belongings left behind, as if they had simply been erased from the earth. The authorities back then had suspected the Harpers, but the family's good reputation and the absence of hard proof had frustrated every attempt to bring them to justice. Even worse were Brewster's accounts of the Harpers themselves. Zachariah had been a towering lay preacher whose sermons and generosity made him a beloved figure, while Prudence was a small, delicate woman known for her healing skills. They had arrived claiming to be refugees from Indian attacks with no clear history before their sudden appearance, and quickly became the center of community life. Brewster's description of the Harper children matched the Hardin children so precisely in age and demeanor that Winters knew in his heart they were the same people. The Harper family had vanished overnight in the spring of 1791, abandoning their farm in a scene of deliberate destruction. Buildings partially burned, wells filled, anything that might reveal who they truly were, obliterated. When the Tennessee authorities finally searched the deserted property, they found shallow graves hidden in the woods containing both human and animal remains, along with personal belongings of some of the missing travelers. By that time, the Harpers had disappeared entirely, and a 6-month manhunt turned up nothing. The case was abandoned, with the assumption they had fled far beyond the reach of the law. What Brewster revealed was clear. The Hardin family were not just a local menace, but seasoned killers who had already done this before refining their methods, erasing their tracks, and leaving behind a trail of death across states. They had learned from Tennessee, becoming more cunning, more careful, and infinitely deadlier in Kentucky, where they had been hunting for 8 years without a single piece of evidence sticking to them. Winters understood that while the peddler's story was damning, it was not enough to arrest a family this powerful. He needed undeniable proof, something no judge or jury could dismiss. That proof came in a way he could never have predicted. On the night of May 22nd, 1799, Mercy Hardin came to him. She appeared like a ghost at his door, her young face streaked with tears, her body trembling with terror. For 3 hours she poured out the truth that would shatter the facade of respectability around her family and expose the horror within their walls. With halting, horrified words, Mercy confessed that for over 8 years her family had been murdering travelers just as they had done in Tennessee. It had all been orchestrated by Ezekiel, who had convinced his family they were carrying out the will of God, punishing the unworthy who traveled the frontier. This was no random violence, but an organized system with a clear, methodical process. It began with Ezekiel's so-called evaluation. He approached travelers under the guise of neighborly concern, asking about their lives, families, and beliefs, while secretly deciding if they deserved judgment. To him, wealth was a sign of greed, education of arrogance, parents who brought children into danger of reckless endangerment, and even preachers could be condemned for doctrinal errors. Once Ezekiel decided on their guilt, the family would extend an invitation that few could refuse: a warm bed and a safe place to rest. Their reputation for hospitality ensured travelers accepted, especially if the weather was bad or their wagons needed repair. Guests were fed a fine meal made comfortable with conversation and music, then led in evening prayers by Ezekiel, whose deep voice and scripture made the whole evening feel like a blessing. What they did not know was that the last drink they consumed was laced with a drug concocted by temperance, a mix of herbs that would render them drowsy and unable to fight back. When the victims awoke, they found themselves in a nightmare beneath the Hardin farm. The simple root cellar described to neighbors was, as Mercy revealed, actually an enormous underground complex dug deep into the earth and stretching nearly 200 yards with levels connected by stairs and ladders. The main chamber was a grotesque courtroom, complete with a crude judge's bench carved from stone shackles in the walls and religious symbols warped into instruments of terror. Here Ezekiel conducted trials that were nothing but a twisted performance, reading out the supposed sins of his captives before pronouncing sentences that had been decided from the start. The courtroom gave the family a way to believe that their crimes were righteous. Murder became execution. Slaughter became sacrifice, and they could see themselves not as killers, but as purifiers of the land. Some victims were forced to live for weeks or months in the underground cells, kept alive only as long as their skills were useful. Dr. Cromwell Mercy admitted had been made to teach temperance advanced surgical techniques before being executed. Reverend Cross was compelled to write sermons that Ezekiel later delivered as if they were his own, boosting his standing in the county. Others died quickly, their method of death chosen according to Ezekiel's twisted sense of divine justice. Thieves were hanged, the prideful drowned. Each act carried out with ritualistic precision in the dark beneath the Hardin farm. The most elaborate executions were always reserved for those Ezekiel deemed the worst offenders: wealthy merchants, government men, and anyone bold enough to question his vision of frontier faith. And just when it seemed the nightmare could not grow darker, the horror on the Kentucky frontier took an even more terrifying turn. If this story chills you, Share it with someone who loves true dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support these investigations and subscribe so you never miss a case like this. What Mercy revealed to Constable Winters stripped away every illusion about the Harden family. She explained in harrowing detail how each member had a defined role in a killing machine that had run like clockwork for years. Caleb and Josiah were the force that captured the victims, managed the underground tunnels, and dragged the drugged bodies through a network of limestone passages that reached deep into the earth. Mercy, trapped by her own family's madness, was forced to act as their chronicler, keeping ledgers that listed every victim as though they were merchandise, noting down their names. Ages, appearance, belongings, and final words with the precision of an accountant. Temperance's part was central. She prepared the drugs that made victims helpless, kept them alive when their skills were useful, and ensured the executions left nothing that could be traced. Her deep knowledge of healing earned from years of tending to the sick had been twisted into a mastery of torture. She created what she called treatments for captives, who resisted mixing pain and fear until their will to fight broke without killing them. Their ability to stay invisible came from their ruthless disposal of all evidence. Bodies were never left near the farm, but dragged through the cave system to hidden limestone caverns miles away, where no one would ever find them. Valuables were sorted with care money jewelry, and tools either kept or sold far from Millfield, while ordinary belongings were scattered across trails to make it look like bandits or Indians had struck. Even clothing was processed, useful pieces kept, and anything distinctive destroyed. Horses, always the most obvious clues, were sold through shady traders in distant counties, ensuring they could not be traced. Their greatest weapon, however, was their own good name. Every sermon Ezekiel preached every time Temperance nursed a sick child back to health, and every show of kindness was part of their shield. They built an image so strong that no one wanted to imagine them capable of evil. They even had plans for when suspicion rose. Pause the killings, flood the town with charity, and if it came to it, abandon the farm, just as they had done in Tennessee. And it wasn't just about Beaver Creek anymore. According to Mercy, Ezekiel had begun preparing to expand to set up more hidden courts of judgment along the road, creating a chain of death across the frontier that he believed would purge it of the unworthy. But it wasn't guilt that had driven her to confess. It was fear. Her father's growing paranoia had begun turning inward. He had already decided that neighbors who asked too many questions, the peddler Isaac Brewster, who spoke too freely, and even Winters himself, would soon need to face judgment, and there was no time left. 3 people were still alive beneath that farm. A traveling surveyor named William Patterson, taken 3 days earlier, was to be judged the following night. With him was Rebecca Foster, a young woman missing for more than a week, and Luther Grimby, an old preacher who had vanished the month before. Their presence showed how bold the family had become, holding prisoners, as if death had become a routine. The killings had grown into an organized slaughterhouse hidden beneath the Kentucky soil, and Winters realized that, by dawn, there would be no more time to wait. If Mercy's warning was true, there were only hours before 3 captives were killed, and Constable Winters knew any hesitation could cost lives. Yet, a direct assault on the Harden farm was close to suicide. Ezekiel and his family had spent years fortifying their land, storing weapons, and drilling for this exact moment. Any attack risked alerting them, and once alerted they could escape or slaughter the captives before help arrived. The alternative, riding for reinforcements in Lexington, meant abandoning William Patterson, Rebecca Foster, and Luther Grimby to their fates. In that moment, Winters made the most difficult decision of his career. He would not wait. He would attack, but he would not attack alone. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer and former soldier who had long suspected the Hardens, offered his help immediately. His military experience and knowledge of the woods would be crucial. Isaac Brewster, the seasoned peddler whose information had exposed the Harpers' past, insisted on joining, as well determined to atone for the chance he had missed in Tennessee. 2 more men, Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran Indian fighter, completed a grim rescue party. Together, they devised a desperate plan. They would strike after midnight, using darkness and surprise to approach without being seen. The primary objective was simple: rescue the captives. Capturing the Hardens was secondary. If the killers resisted, they were to be stopped by any means necessary. Mercy's knowledge of the farm proved essential. She explained the layout of the house, the tunnels, and the 2 entrances to the underground complex, the root cellar beneath the main house, and a concealed escape route in the woods a quarter-mile away. Winters split his men accordingly. He and Johansson would enter through the main cellar. Stokes and Crawford would ambush the hidden exit. Brewster stayed back with the horses, ready to fire from a distance if the fight spilled out into the open. Johansson mapped a path that used dry creek beds and thickets of trees to mask their approach. Every step was silent, slow, and deliberate. By the time they reached the edge of the Harden farm, the stench of death had already begun to hang in the air. Even in darkness, they could see the signs, earth heaped up in strange piles, trenches from recent digging, and the faint, unnatural glow of lanterns moving underground. From the main house, everything looked peaceful, a warm light in the windows, smoke drifting from the chimney. But then came the sounds, low voices echoing from beneath the ground. The rhythmic clink of metal on stone, and every so often, a muffled scream that was cut short. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, the rescuers advanced. Winters and Johansson descended the main entrance into the underground, while Stokes and Crawford sealed the escape route. Inside the root cellar revealed itself to be no cellar at all, but a fortress, a system of reinforced tunnels with choke points designed to trap and kill intruders. But the Hardens, arrogant after years of unchallenged slaughter, were not prepared. When Winters burst into the main chamber, Ezekiel and his sons were not guarding the tunnels. They were preparing for another execution. The rescuers struck fast. Patterson was found chained upright in a stone cell, battered and starving, but alive. Rebecca Foster, covered in bruises and half-conscious, had endured weeks of the cruel treatments Temperance used to break prisoners. Grimby, the old preacher, lay curled in a corner, so weak he could barely open his eyes. As Winters freed the captives, Johansson pressed deeper into the tunnels, and what he discovered turned the hardened veteran pale. The underground complex was far larger than even Mercy's confession had suggested. Room after room revealed the ghosts of 8 years of murder. Bones, some neatly stacked, others scattered, filled chamber after chamber. Rusted chains hung from the walls. In one room, heaps of clothing and personal belongings lay like offerings. The ledgers Mercy had described were there, just as she promised, their pages filled with the names of 67 dead travelers, alongside cold, detailed notes about their possessions and deaths. And then they reached the courtroom. It was exactly as Mercy had said. A limestone chamber with a carved bench where Ezekiel passed his judgments. On the walls were trophies, rings, watches, knives, scalps, all displayed like sacred relics. Here there was no doubt no defense that could hide the truth. The Hardens had built a shrine to their murders, and in the flickering lantern light, the rescuers could see just how deeply and proudly the family believed in what they had done. This chamber, with its evidence of horror, marked the end of their secrecy. The Hardens' killing ground had been exposed, and their years of hunting the innocent were over. The capture of the Harden family was swift, but erupted into violence when Ezekiel and his sons chose to fight their way out of the underground maze rather than submit to the justice they had denied so many others. Ezekiel met the intruders without shock, delivering a frenzied sermon on divine judgment, even as gunfire rang through the tunnels. Caleb and Josiah fought with desperate fury, their knowledge of the twisting chambers allowing them to launch sudden ambushes from hidden alcoves, and for nearly an hour, the attackers advanced slowly through passageways that had been prepared as traps and kill zones. The battle ended only when Temperance, trapped above in the house, set fire to the building in an attempt to destroy evidence. The flames spread quickly through the dry timber and threatened to bring the entire entrance crashing down, leaving those below with the choice of surrender or burning alive. Faced with certain death, the surviving Hardens laid down their weapons. Mercy alone surrendered quietly, already condemned by her own confession found in her room, kneeling in prayer and resigned to judgment. Her cooperation had not been born of conscience, but of terror that her father's paranoia would soon turn on her as it had so many others. The aftermath of the raid on the Harden farm shocked Kentucky and the entire frontier. Communities that had once revered the family now faced the truth that for nearly a decade their neighbors had been systematically hunting and murdering travelers. The sheer amount of evidence recovered overwhelmed even hardened investigators. The labyrinth beneath the farm was far larger than Mercy had described, nearly 2 miles of modified limestone caverns, with chambers capable of holding dozens of prisoners at once. The remains and personal effects found there revealed a history of murder that stretched back long before their time in Kentucky. Among the discoveries were children's clothes and toys, proof that entire families had been wiped out. The fate of the Henleys, missing since the December blizzard, was revealed in heartbreaking detail. They had been kept in captivity for over a week before the parents were executed, and their 2 children, just 6 and 8 years old, were killed days later. The trial that began in Lexington in late June 1799 became a spectacle that lasted nearly a month. Every day the courthouse was filled with grieving relatives, scholars of the law, and curious onlookers who recognized that the case was unlike anything in American history. Judge Samuel Whitmore ordered portions of the testimony sealed because of its disturbing nature. Throughout the proceedings, Ezekiel refused to show remorse, turning his time on the stand into sermons about his supposed mission, claiming every murder had been commanded by God in a holy war to cleanse the frontier. He described the stolen property not as theft, but as divine reward, and the underground chambers not as a prison, but as a courtroom where God's justice was carried out. Temperance and her sons tried to argue that they had been forced into the crimes by Ezekiel's fanaticism, but the evidence destroyed their claims. Mercy's records, with notations in multiple handwritings, showed that all family members had willingly taken part. Their rooms contained trophies, rings, jewelry trinkets from the dead, that revealed that for them, the murders had long ceased to be about survival or righteousness. Only Mercy expressed remorse, but even her testimony made it clear that her decision to betray her family had been born from fear rather than repentance. She gave the court key insights into how her family lured travelers, carried out the killings, and disposed of the evidence. And with her help, many of the bones and belongings recovered from the underground labyrinth were linked to names long thought lost. Her testimony, while damning, was invaluable, and because of her willingness to speak against her own family, she was spared the gallows, though the punishment she received was still severe. Judge Whitmore handed down sentences that were as swift as they were uncompromising. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Harden were condemned to die by hanging on August 15, 1799, a date chosen precisely 1 year after the disappearance of Samuel Fletcher had set the first pieces of the investigation in motion. Mercy Harden, whose cooperation had saved the lives of the last 3 captives and revealed the full scope of the murders, was sentenced to life imprisonment instead of death. She would spend 43 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, living out her days as one of the longest-serving prisoners in the history of the institution. The public execution drew an immense crowd, more than 4,000 people from across Kentucky and neighboring territories. Vendors and curious onlookers filled the outskirts of Lexington as if for a fair. But at the center of the spectacle was a grim reckoning. Ezekiel remained defiant to the end, delivering a final sermon from the scaffold, in which he cursed those who condemned him, declaring that Kentucky would be punished for destroying God's chosen judges. His wife and son stood silent when the hangman's work began, their deaths closing the darkest chapter of murder the frontier had ever known. After the executions, the Hardin farm was deliberately erased. Every building was set ablaze and reduced to rubble, the land left scarred and barren. The vast network of caverns beneath was collapsed with explosives and sealed forever, a tomb for the countless souls who had perished there. Local leaders declared the site cursed, forbidding anyone from ever rebuilding on that ground. Yet the family's crimes left scars that went far beyond Beaver Creek. The case of the Hardins changed how frontier settlements thought about trust, law, and justice. It led to the first laws requiring thorough verification of land ownership, the formalization of missing persons investigations, and new rules allowing circumstantial evidence to carry weight when direct proof was impossible. Communities shaken by how completely evil had hidden behind a facade of piety and charity became less willing to accept reputations at face value. Mercy Hardin's testimony proved that even family ties could be broken by the weight of truth, and her cooperation set a precedent for the use of insider witnesses in complex criminal prosecutions. By 1801, with the trials concluded, the court ordered all records of the case to be sealed, both to shield victims' families from the morbid curiosity that followed the trial, and to ensure that no other monsters on the frontier would see in the Hardins' methods a blueprint for their own ambitions. For almost 200 years, the full truth about the Hardin family lay locked away in sealed court files, the details fading into fragments of folklore and whispered stories along Beaver Creek. Historians granted access to those files were forced to sign strict agreements promising never to publish or speak about what they read. And as the decades passed, the specifics of the murders dissolved into vague warnings about bad people who once lived in the area. Even the location of the farm became uncertain, as property lines shifted and new families settled there, unaware of the blood-soaked history. By the middle of the 19th century, only a handful of elderly residents could still point to where the Hardin homestead had stood. When the case files were rediscovered in 1987, they allowed historians to finally piece together the full account of Kentucky's first serial-killing family. But even now, there are questions without answers. The caverns where the Hardins disposed of their victims have never been fully explored, and there are strong suspicions that deep in those sealed and dangerous tunnels lie additional remains that investigators of the 18th century could never reach. Modern forensic science might tell more of the story, but local authorities have little interest in disturbing the dead, fearing the trauma that new discoveries would bring to descendants of the victims. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of the case lies in the larger mystery it raises about the American frontier. How many other disappearances from that era, long attributed to storms, wild animals, or hostile tribes, were really the work of families like the Hardins, hiding their crimes behind a mask of piety and hospitality? Statistical studies of disappearances on wilderness roads show troubling clusters around other charitable and prosperous families in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia during the same decades. While no one has been able to prove a connection to systematic murder, the similarities are too striking to dismiss and have become the subject of serious historical debate. Whatever the answers, they died with Ezekiel Hardin on that August morning in 1799, leaving only speculation. The story is a grim reminder that evil rarely announces itself with a monster's face. Some of the worst crimes in history have been committed by those convinced they were serving a higher purpose. And the isolation of the frontier gave such predators perfect freedom to hunt. The case also shows how fragile early communities were built on reputation rather than evidence, and how the desire to trust could blind people to signs that something was terribly wrong. That blindness cost dozens of lives. The Hardin story forces us to confront a darker, more complicated truth about frontier life than the heroic myths usually told. Westward expansion created chances for freedom and new beginnings. But it also created the perfect hunting ground for those who understood how to exploit the fear, faith, and desperation of others. What do you think? Did the 1987 discovery finally reveal everything about the Hardin family's crimes? Or do darker secrets still lie buried under the Kentucky soil? Could other families have committed similar atrocities and gone undiscovered forever? Share your theories in the comments. And if you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that uncover the eerie side of history, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a mystery. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.